people to come up and briefly, I'm just going to ask you to give a round of applause and then they're going to introduce themselves. Let's whoever's in the middle. Let's go for Trudy Elliott. Trudy, could I ask you to step up? Trudy's Chief Executive of the Royal Town Planning Institute. Thank you very much indeed. Let's see if we can get Robert Evans in there next. Mr. Evans is partner at Argent Property Development Services. Keep that applause going. Thank you very much indeed. Andrew Telfer, step up Andrew, Divisional Chief Executive, Wilmot Dixon Regen. And lastly, your applause please for Mark. Mark Blessing, you're here, Founder, Director and CEO of Pocket. Right, panel, you've each got a sentence, maybe a sentence and a half, very briefly, to say what it is that you do, precisely. And in that sentence, in one sentence, you're also going to say, if I was Prime Minister, regarding this sector, I would do one thing. So you're going to say what it is you do, and if you were Prime Minister, what you would do. In no particular order, because you happen to be closest to me. And I'll just share a trick with you, by the way, that David Dimbleby does during question time. If you see me start to go with my glasses, you know I think you're going on a bit too long, as and when you get going, because you'll have a chance to give me your points. If you see my actually glasses go towards my head, as Mr. Dimbleby does, you know that's when to shut up. He tells you this when you start question time. If you actually see my glasses on there, then I'm probably going to dive in because you've gone. So the first thing is a couple of sentences just to say what you are, who you are rather, and what you would do if you were Prime Minister. Then you'll get about 5 or 6 minutes to respond to Andrew. Mark Blessing, who are you, what do you do, and what would you do as Prime Minister?
So my name is, I'm Chief Executive of Pocket. We are a developer of starter homes in London, focused on the squeeze middle. And if I was Prime Minister, I would release an untold quantity of public land onto the market so as to depress land prices as fast as possible.
Trudy.
I'm Trudy Elliott. I'm the Chief Executive of the Royal Town Planning Institute. We represent 23,000 planners and friends of planning in the public and private sector. And if I was Prime Minister today, I would have a comprehensive plan across all government departments addressing this issue rather than addressing it in a piecemeal issue.
Andrew Telfer.
I'm a main board director of Wilmot Dixon, and we deal with the development side of the business. I deal with the development side of the business, which is delivered through Be Here, which is our PRS brand, and through Prime Place, which is our for sale brand. And if I was Prime Minister, I would certainly strive to get the politics out of planning.
Oh, that's interesting. Mr. Evans, Robert Evans.
Hello, I'm Robert Evans from Argent. We're a mixed-use developer, mostly in London, Manchester, and Birmingham. If I was Prime Minister, I'd probably look at actually getting the public sector starts up, because the really telling graph that was shown was that the private sector ain't doing it and never has. And so actually, how do we get registered providers, housing associations, a public sector building again? Because they haven't been doing it since 1979.
This is how it's going to work. Each of the panel gets about 5 or 6 minutes, broadly speaking, to respond to what they've heard, and there's plenty of time for you to get questions. And also, you can take part by going on the hashtag. Gerald, I can't even see. Was it top right? I'm so sorry. Hashtag. I'm sorry, Michael. Thank you. Hashtag strategic land. Hashtag HL Real Estate. But questions from you in 20, 25 minutes, something like that. And then I think there's a glass of something afterwards. Right. Let's start. If you don't mind, Mark, I'm going to come to you because you introduced yourself first. So you're a developer. What I took from Andrew's presentation there is really you and your sector, you've got to think big. You're not thinking big enough, are you? This is the problem.
Well, I think there's a real problem with the biggest argument, and I'm no sizist, but I think big is not necessarily the answer. Ask yourself this. Over the last 25, 30 years, the top 5 house builders in this country have gone from a responsibility of around 25% of housing to around 65% of housing, and the SME sector has disappeared. Small to medium-sized developers and contractors have essentially been competed out of the market by this very biggest approach that we have in this country. And we also don't have the contracting base anymore. We'll talk about that, I'm sure, later on, but there's a real skills shortage. So I always get very, very worried about biggest and large. I mean, it seems to me that there is clearly a huge disequilibrium between supply and demand in this country because we're not building enough. And if the volume house builder and the housing association industries have not been able to respond to this imbalance that has been going on for the better part of 25 years, then it's highly unlikely that they're going to be able to do anything very much different over the next 25 years. So if you want to have a renaissance in house building, you have to get it from somewhere else, somewhere new, somewhere fresh. and that's from the SME sector. That means that you have to lower the administrative barriers and the financial barriers to entry for the small developers and the small contractors. I'm not saying you shouldn't do big stuff as well, because overall, I actually don't think that there is a one-size-fits-all solution to the housing crisis. But if you just concentrate on this very big stuff, I don't think we're going to be any much further. And I'll tell you why. Ultimately, countries get the housing that they deserve culturally. And culturally, we have a political framework in this country which stands in the way of big. We don't have regional governments sitting between the long-term plans of national government and the NIMBYist tendencies of local government. We don't actually have a huge amount of trust in our public institutions. And big requires you to have public infrastructure, public attitudes, and public administrative political glue that really delivers big at scale, because it's about bringing together integration of transport, education, health, all of those issues to deliver big. And we're just not very good at this in the UK.
But isn't that likely because they're going to get voted out?
It is because the housing delivery market is highly politicised in the UK, and housing plays itself out over 15 years as its cycle, and if it's subjected to a policy process, which is 5 years, which is the political process, then they are always going to clash. So the only way you can get around that is to deliver a national plan and deliver the means of administration to the civil service and take it out of the hands of the politicians. And, you know, anybody who's been to a planning committee in this country has to just ask itself what the hell we think we're doing. You know, planning committees, you know, it's theatre. It's not planning policy, it's planning theatre. And it depends on the performance on the night as to whether you get planning or not. You know, it's not a prescriptive system. Now, you know, I've been asking for a prescriptive planning system for the last 20 years. I'm now told by, you know, people who've been thinking about this much harder than I have over the last 20 years, we're just not going to get it. Why? Because the Germans and the Dutch do trust their civil service to deliver a prescriptive system, and we don't. So we're always going to have a fettered system in the UK.
You would allow people to appeal, surely. If somebody decides to put up a block of flats opposite me, surely I'm allowed to have a say about it.
Well, interestingly, the professional development community will tell you that the appeal process is the point at which professional talks to professional in this country. That's the point at which you've moved away from the localist council, often very uninitiated and very inexpert debate in which people with special pleading and special interests who have, you know, access to a lot of fax machines can make a lot of hay and get in the way of decent intentions by politicians and developers. I'm not saying that that level of representation is necessarily a bad thing. I think it imbalances the debate hugely.
Mark, what's a fax machine?
What's the fax machine?
That's not a bad question. Yes, come back to that. Some of us remember, you're far too young. Some of us know. Trudy Elliott, Royal Chief Executive, Royal Town Planning Institute. My God, you're going to be busy. You're going to be building all the way down to Brighton. We're going to build over Greenbelt. We're going to build by the side of railway stations. Totally comfortable with that?
Well, I think our view is...
well, perhaps you'd say, totally comfortable with that, yes or no?
Well, I don't think it's a yes or no answer.
Oh, okay. Go on.
Our view is if you're going to address the housing challenge that's built up over 30 years, there is no one solution. So we've got to recreate the SME market. We've got to get the public sector back into commissioning or building land, because the private sector, you know, as Robert has said, has consistently delivered about the same numbers over the last 30 years. We need to do something about the complexity of the planning system and the regularity with which the system is changed. Every time we get new politicians in, because it's a lever they can affect, changes occur, and that in itself, every time we change the system, whether you like it or not, it slows the system down, and we've suffered for that over some period. I think this depoliticisation, though, fails to address the issue of the public approach to housing, and we have not yet persuaded the public of the challenge we face. Statistically,
why do you say that? What makes you think that?
Well, the evidence is, if you look at the a range of surveys, but a big one was undertaken by the Local Government Association, and we have now persuaded the public that there is a national housing crisis. Something like 79% think there is, but they don't think it's near them. it goes to under 50% in their own community, which is why when you're proposing something either in a local plan or individual applications, you face an enormous challenge. Also, we've passed the responsibility down to deciding either where you allocate land or individual applications to local authorities, who then don't also have control over the supporting infrastructure and all the facilities and the widest infrastructure that Andrew talked about, that you need to create places. And what the public is interested in is creating good places, not just creating housing somewhere. And until we line those two up, we're in difficulty.
And how likely is that? That sounds like quite a challenge.
Well, it is a challenge, but we travel hopefully. At the moment, we've got some critical short-term problems. We've got a crisis in resourcing in local government. Most planning authorities are not resourced to deliver the job we've asked them to deliver, and we're publishing research on that next week with some solutions. So that is a key challenge for us. We're not planning over a wide enough area. We abolished the regional spatial strategies, but we haven't really incentivised cooperation. We've got a duty to cooperate, but it's not a duty to agree. And we've looked at sticks rather than carrots. And our view is you've got to follow the money. You've got to incentivise places to cooperate over a housing market area or an economic area. You've got to get LEPs joined up with planning and look at this strategically, or we're never going to address it. And then we've got to address the context, the wider context in which planning operates. If we haven't got the skills, we're currently permitting over 100,000 more houses a year than we're building because we haven't got the skills anywhere in the...
What do we build per annum, roughly?
I haven't got the figure in front of me.
Andrew, do you have to?
140.
How many is it? 140, thank you, whoever that was. And what do we feel we need to be building? About 240?
240, 250 is the general view. Yeah.
All right. Just one last final point, Trudy, before we move on to you. As regards you talk about the general public, how can that message be got across then? That it is actually effectively in their backyard?
Well, I think we've all got to do more. I think there's a real role for political leadership at every level. We've got to do a lot more work around the arguments about what creates a good place and what difference it makes. And we've got to have people interested in engaging in that. But it's a massive challenge. And I think the press has got a really big issue on their hands. I think we're going to see in the mayoral election, as we saw in the general election, last time round, where was housing? Really nowhere.
No, at all.
In the general election, it was a big issue. I think it's going to be a massive issue in the London mayoral election, and I think that will change the game.
We'll talk more about that perhaps a little bit later. Let's come to Robert, bring you in for your views on what you heard. And obviously we all know, well, you were telling me, and I'm sure most people in this room know that you've done the development up at King's Cross. How successfully did you work with local authorities there or otherwise, Robert?
Well, very well, actually. I think actually, bizarrely, when you have those really big projects, I think it's easier than when you're battling away at the medium-scale ones, because a project like King's Cross, or anything like that scale of project, you generally get the interest of the chief planning officer, you get the attention of the chief executive of the council, you can engage with the senior members of the local authority, and it matters. It matters, and it's very important in the numbers. I don't know what proportion of Camden's affordable housing programme King's Cross was in the last few years, but I bet you it's more than 50%, probably a lot more than 50%. So in that context, King's Cross matters to that particular borough, and that means that there's obviously a conversation, a dialogue. And I think actually, in that case, Camden resourced King's Cross really well. It's actually been a very successful partnership. Most of the applications, I don't know how many we've done, 70 or 80 major applications in the last 7 or 8 years. The average processing time is 11 weeks. So local authorities can do it. You put the resources in, they can handle planning. I think the problem comes when you go down a notch, frankly. You go down to the sort of medium-scale projects, you go down to the smaller projects, where you get a lot more political interference, if you like, in the process, and you get people who you get a different, sometimes lower level of officer, and no one cares as much, frankly, about making sure your project happens, and so projects get stuck in the system for months and years in some cases. You hear these sort of horror stories. And even in Camden, most people, when we started on King's Cross, would come up to us and say, "You're working with Camden?" And you'd say, yeah. And then they'll tell you a horror story about Camden, and actually that just hasn't been our experience. So I think that authority has changed, and also I think King's Cross is so important. I think it's generally the smaller and medium-scale projects that get such a bad rub. When going back to Trudy's point, I think I read the BBC survey. They said that housing was number 10 in the election list of topics. So in terms of what people said about what mattered to them in the election. So I'm still unsure that housing it gets talked about a lot in our industry and around it, but I'm still not sure when it comes to what politicians really think about what drives voters. The NHS, immigration, other topics loom much larger, I think, and there's so many people for whom increased house prices is just a good thing as far as their wallet is concerned, and that's a very, very large constituency of people. And I still think that still looms in this debate incredibly large, and I don't think it is still the biggest issue that we all perhaps think it is. In terms of how we start to address it, I think quite apart from all the planning things that Andrew talked about, we touched on a couple of structural things. I do think we have to work out where the skills are. I slightly disagree with Mark in the sense that I'm all for the SME sector and getting smaller builders and smaller developers going again. We haven't had that in this country for a long time. But if we really are going to hit the numbers, we have to look at where the real resources are. And it's in the private sector, which is bumbling along in the way we have. We have to find a way of working with the housing associations. We have to get more out of them and combine them with people like us and people like Mark and Andrew and others, and create almost a national purpose around this and create new forms of joint venture that deliver these homes. Because actually the RP sector, it hasn't delivered the numbers as the graph showed, but it has enormous skills. It has enormous public support. People generally like the idea of a social model that delivers homes on a not-for-profit basis. They manage better than most people. So I think there's a huge amount of skill and goodwill and trust and, frankly, bank balances in that sector. The RP sector has got enormous borrowing capacity because of the assets that it owns. So I think we need to make more of it. And David Cameron came out very recently in quite a strongly worded attack on the RP sector, having just slashed their rents. And said, you need to get more efficient. And I think there is some truth in that, but I think we need to get them more efficient and give them clearer regulation so they can actually understand what their primary objective is. And their primary objective should be to work with others to deliver a certain national house building target. At the moment, the regulatory signals given to that sector are just too confusing. It's look after your asset base, don't overstretch yourselves, and can you build some homes as well? And I think there's something in the clarity of message to that sector that I think is really important, given that we don't have a public sector in the local authority or state sense anymore that can just suddenly switch the light on and deliver 100,000 homes a year.
Robert, thank you. Let's come to Andrew again for your views. Just briefly, Andrew, again, being big, being bold, being connected, as we heard from the other Andrew, would you be happy to build on green land, green belt?
Well, I don't think it's the most sustainable approach to do that. I'd definitely prefer to hit the brownfield sites.
Are there enough?
Metropolitan green belt is another question. There are areas where you might have a car park or something like that on the metropolitan green belt that, arguably that should be looked at. So I do think metropolitan green belt is something that we should look at, but less so on green belt. All of it will depend on the density and the policy that is allowable and how high we can go within the M25, of course.
And what did you take from the presentation? What worked for you and what didn't?
I think the density factors within the M25, I agree with. When it comes down to the nuts and bolts, though, you've got to think about where people, where is the demand coming from? The significant demand, population growth coming through, and you've got to be able to cater for each segment. And young professionals are often overlooked, I believe. I rented in London for 9 years myself in buy-to-let, and the PRS sector, which is every week you read Property Week, there's some new PRS operator. But I genuinely believe properly developed PRS, private rented sector solutions are going to be part of the stepping stone process. And it is in the DNA of this country that people will want home ownership ultimately. Whether we ever get to the Dutch or the German models where people actually are given an opportunity to invest in property through REITs, for example, alongside renting, and feeling that they're getting that value for money through rent. That there are those sort of dynamics. But you do need the proximity to rail network. The problem, I think, is...
Isn't that being made better, though, by these other rail links that are
It's being made better, but the existing routes through, the trunk routes, there are pinch points. So if you take East Croydon, for example, which I know fairly well, there's only a certain number of tracks, and Clapham Junction, a certain number of tracks there, and ultimately, and anyone travelling into London Bridge in this room will be very familiar with the issues at London Bridge, albeit it's been expanded. Ultimately, you can increase the length of the trains, but how much capacity will that really get you for those routes where people are already living in those areas outside of London? I do like the idea of thinking about the wider 20 million, London and the wider southeast that depend on living and working in
but won't that just increase the pressure points? Won't that make East Croydon, London Bridge?
So the sort of solutions I don't know if they've been looked at, but the double-decker train service,
well, they won't go through the tunnels, will they?
Exactly. Well, have people looked at modular bridge solutions?
Right.
Have these things been thought about rather than, well, let's just put another track where now if you look at East Croydon, there isn't room either side of that.
I'm getting a lot of... I'll come back here. And let's talk a little bit about these railway lines. You don't think there's such a problem. Sorry, Andrew at the back there. I'm waving to you. Andrew.
The purpose of looking at London across this broader geography is to say that we really should be joining up our investment decisions around infrastructure and housing growth across that bigger area. So individually, we're not talking about any more people than live here now already. It's just actually thinking at that scale, rather than TfL draw their line pretty much at the boundary of Greater London. Yeah. Yet there are 1 million people commuting in and out beyond that boundary every day, and we really should be. And so actually, a lot of the housing growth is happening. It is happening in the Greenbelt already, but because those local authorities haven't got their plans in place, the developers are pushing it through the appeal process, and often in spite of plans, it's happening. Or we're building on quality agricultural land beyond the Greenbelt, which means that people have even longer commutes.
But Andrew,
my assertion is draw it together and actually think about it at that scale, at that regional scale.
Let's bring Mark in. Mark?
I haven't come across many policymakers or politicians who don't believe that in 50 years' time, even 25 years' time, the remit of the GLA will have been extended significantly from where it is at the moment. It does not make sense to stop the remit of the GLA where it is at the moment. So I think that's naturally going to happen. It's taken us a long time to get to a metropolitan power base with a mayor of London who's actually got some significant executive power. May not have the fiscal base of the mayor of New York, but he's got some significant powers. I think that's going to grow.
Quick response from you on that, Andrew?
Yes, but I don't think we have to wait for that before this collaboration across those boundaries can start.
Trudy, you want to make a point, and I'm going to see if there's any questions. I've got some emails as well. Trudy?
I think
Yes, I think we'll hear you. Go ahead.
I think Andrew's comments raise a couple of issues that we've looked at. One is how we appraise transport proposals. We basically, the Treasury and DfT model doesn't factor in appropriately the development that the proposal unlocks. So it's all about speed and congestion, not about development potential. And until we properly appraise transport proposals, we're never really going to join them up appropriately. And we've focused very much so far in this conversation about London and the Greater South East. We do need to look beyond Watford Gap. And I think some of the proposals about city region devolution, their ability, if we give them the powers to join up housing, planning for the economy and transport, might give us an opportunity of improving their performance, because they're underperforming relative to the rest of Europe.
I was going to bring in what I think is called the Northern Powerhouse. Is that one? Let's do that. We'll come back to that now. Let's just see if there's any questions, then I'll come back to my Northern Powerhouse in just a second. Quickly throw it open for 1 point now. I've got some email questions. Anybody want to raise questions? There's a young man in a red shirt there. Sir, go ahead. Yes, sir, you. No? Yes, you.
Pink.
It's pink.
It's pink. Put your glove.
Was it confused by pink or
You're in a shirt anyway, which is an improvement.
It just goes, to some extent, this conference is a little bit London-centric. You just hit the point.
Yeah.
If you look at the Green Belt, it strangles every single major city in this country. Oxford is strangled, Bristol is strangled, London is strangled. I was at the HBF conference where Trudy was speaking, and a lot of people have said, why is it that this government doesn't allow Greenbelt to be released where it will sustain urban extensions, and particularly this nonsense that people are leapfrogging over the Greenbelt to go and live in Horsham, and then the trains are full of Horsham, whereas if Quad, the planning consultancy, say you could build 600,000 houses within 10 minutes of tube stations or train stations in London. This is the policy that we should be adopting, not pushing it all the way out and having people to come back in here.
It's a nice shirt, whatever colour it is. Let's take you first, Robert, then come quickly on the panel. The response over to the gentleman.
Well, the point about the Greenbelt reminds me of a comment, truly remember this, that we both heard Ben Page from Ipsos Mori say last week, actually. He said that in all this debate, he said they surveyed people and they found that 25% of people had never heard of the Greenbelt. But at 83% wanted to keep it because it sounded good. So I think that sort of sums up the Greenbelt. My worry about the Greenbelt thing is, I mean, I listened to a really erudite speech by David Rudlin of Urbed, who won the Wolfson Prize, and he was explaining his whole theory basically about Oxford, really, which is the strangulation point you make, which is if you're going to build a garden city, don't try and build a new one. Learn the lesson from the new towns where they took so long to become real places. Graft it onto an existing place like Oxford, and then develop around something like Oxford, and he had other examples too, and create a garden city on the basis of an existing place like Oxford. And it is a really powerful idea, and if you believe in sort of place shaping and place making and joining up infrastructure and land and planning, it is a very, very, sort of a compelling narrative. My worry is that I just don't think it's ever going to happen in this political system. I think the Greenbelt is just too difficult still to touch.
It's interesting you mentioned new towns, and I saw, Andrew, in your presentation, until a few months ago, Nick Clegg, the Deputy Prime Minister, used to appear every Thursday on LBC with me. It was a regular thing he looked forward to. Sadly, now all he looks forward to every week is his Ocado delivery. But as regards new towns, yes, you can repeat that. As regards new towns, Andrew, briefly, you do see it as part of the solution.
Yeah, I see it as part of the solution, but absolutely, as Robert's saying there, that let's not go for a lot of individual places that are just too small to succeed. The lesson from the Newtown programme in the 1940s through to the 92, when they started when the corporations ended, is that the smaller new towns don't have the critical mass for the kind of public services that people want, or the kind of infrastructure that they want. The bigger ones are more successful. Milton Keynes is more successful. Warrington is more successful.
What is the population of Milton Keynes? Pardon my ignorance.
300,000.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's big.
So graft new settlements and extensions onto existing settlements, yes, but also take those new towns that aren't successful and make them bigger, make them stronger places, and reinvest in them. We need a second generation of investment in those places.
Let's talk about the Northern Powerhouse. Have I got that right? Andrew Telford, what is to be learned nationally about the Northern Powerhouse?
It's interesting because if I apply it to my own experience of trying to do development further north, and I'm from the north, so I'll say this quite easily. The economics have proven extremely difficult to work. And that's the thing we mustn't forget here, because if you look at the situation at the moment, this is about how do we deliver. You've got to look at actually how does a developer make its margin. Whether it's around a sales value and a sales rate, because you've got finance costs, whether it's around the rental and the rental yield, if you're on PRS, which will then be linked to wages, correlates to wages. The construction costs that we're all faced with now, and the differentials between the construction costs in London aren't so great as you might expect with the north. Then you need to bear the land cost as well. Is there anything left for a developer margin? And the point about the RPs and the cutting of rents. There are a number of schemes at the moment that are stalled, and it hasn't been properly reported yet. It hasn't really hit the press so much, but there are many schemes stalled, and construction costs.
Because of the point
construction costs, right. Everything's been closing in, and the offers that RPs can make for the Section 106 element of a development has made it even more difficult, and it's more pronounced that we're
Robert, you're waving. You're not going to agree, are you? Because I'm just going to say.
No, well, I think. I think the northern, to answer the question hopefully to a degree, I think the Northern Powerhouse, so we do a lot of work in Manchester.
Right.
And we also do work in Birmingham, and those obviously are two. I think Birmingham isn't part of the Northern Powerhouse, but Manchester definitely is. And I think Manchester is basically leading the charge here. It's worked out a system of, it's got this idea of a combined authority, the 10 authorities coming together. I suspect the leadership of that will be very largely sitting with Richard Leese and Sir Howard Bernstein, who are the leaders of the Manchester City Council. They've been joining up things around the airport and the city centre and the growth of Manchester and skills and the universities. They've been joining all this up for a long time, and they're increasing their kind of city-wide influence. And I think you can see at that level how joining up all these things is actually starting to pay dividends. There are challenging economics. Construction costs all in approaching £250 to £300 a foot, and values not being very different. But actually, I'll tell you one thing, it is a great pleasure to do work in Manchester and Birmingham, because actually the attitude to development is so different, actually. It's much more welcoming, much more can-do. You generally have a really fantastic, proactive conversation about how can we work together to make things happen. So all of our people that work in those cities, actually, they love working there. So it is a great place to do business.
So what I find interesting about this is that if you look at the core cities of this country, which are the cities with a population over 500,000, and you compare them to Germany, all the core cities in Germany, bar one actually, have an average GDP which lies above that of the national GDP, and none of the cities of Britain have a GDP that lies above the average GDP, apart from Bristol and London. And that sort of tells you what an incredible economic challenge places like Birmingham, Leeds, Manchester have over the next 50 years to play catch-up. And one of the real problems that they've got is what economists call the economics of agglomeration, where if you have real depth, vertical depth, whether it's the financial services sector in London today in the 21st century, or it's the textile spindle in Lancashire in the 1930s. Now, if you control an economic vertical, you will attract lots of industry around you, which brings you to the fascinating conclusion that Lancashire was still producing lots of textile garments in the 1950s at a point at which labour rates were about 6 times higher than anything in India. It shouldn't have been possible. But because they were still manufacturing that ubiquitous spindle, they were able to control the economic activity for much longer than they otherwise should. It's very, very hard for cities to catch up with that. And what I haven't yet understood from the Chancellor, or indeed from Leese and Bernstein, who I think, by the way, are doing an amazing job in Manchester, is what are the verticals? What are the economic activities that those places are going to be great at? What are they going to really excel at? Because I'll tell you one thing, once they can articulate that, they're going to be tens of thousands of extremely disaffective young Londoners who want to come and work in those sectors with them.
Just on that, that's why I have a slight worry about the kind of future painted by Andrew, because to me, it just sounds like London becoming bigger and bigger and bigger and more dominant, and skewing that graph that you're referring to more and more, so that the line to get to the 50% line becomes ever harder to hit. And I just worry about sort of fueling the beast, basically, in that way.
Andrew, come to you in a second. Trudy, you want to point at Andrew, perhaps a rebuttal?
We've been doing some
lose the room a bit.
We've been doing some interesting work across the north at the moment with the exam question, do we need a Great North Plan? And that's based on, there's quite a lot of evidence in Europe that actually cities like Manchester, Liverpool, etc., working more collaboratively together rather than being competitive with each other is how some European countries have partly how they've upped the GDP of the non-capital cities. And it's been really interesting. We had roundtables, we've had people flocking to them to talk about this issue, and we've got a big summit in January. And some pretty basic questions come out, like the North being able to articulate what it's for, and particularly as it abuts Scotland. And I think we underestimate how much this has been given a shot in the arm by what's been happening in Scotland and the competition across the board.
Andrew Jones, the first word on your report is big. You might have gone too big.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, what we're proposing here is simply a mechanism and a series of proposals that meet the current projected growth plans for London.
But you hear the concerns of the panel.
So there are other choices. We're currently not. So it's not pushing it any further than the whole series of figures are out there at the moment. What we're saying is there needs to be there needs to be a series of mechanisms to deliver that, because we're not delivering it. Now there are other choices here. We could decide not to deliver all that growth. And actually, London becomes less competitive. It becomes a position where people do make choices to move north or move west or outside London and the southeast. Now that may be a mechanism to help the northern cities in their new generation of development. But I think the point that we've got here is that those people will probably, certainly the higher income people and the more mobile people, will take the choice of going elsewhere outside the UK. And that without having and so we kind of lose that their skill sets and their talent. And if we are going to rebalance the economy in a structured way beyond the city region plans that are coming forward at the moment, then we start looking at national planning, and that ain't something we've been doing for a very long time.
Let's just see if we can have a question from the floor before I go to some emails. Anybody else? We've got a microphone. Yes, there's a young man here, definitely in a white shirt. There's no doubt about it. That is white. If not, your dad's. Pardon? Use the microphone if you would, sir. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. How do we change the culture of this country? Because everything we've heard so far has been, from our point of view, very acceptable. We need more homes. We've heard about planning people. I'm quite surprised that in the profession that brings forward housing, there isn't more depression and suicides. Because we all agree it's a good thing, and then we try and do it. One of my happiest experiences has been dealing with commissions for the new towns, urban development corporations, developments of the size that Robert has been delivering. Somehow in this country, we haven't got the collective will to deliver housing. The slide that we had from Andrew right at the beginning showed that post-war, we had a period of very good housing delivery, and I think about half of it was from the public sector. Mm-hmm. I can remember council houses being built, people being happy to live in them. Somehow we've lost that. And it's as though delivering new homes is a real problem. Now, I've had the experience recently of having my 3 children wanting to find homes to live in London.
I hope you robbed a bank.
I haven't yet. But it brings it home to you. And somehow we've got to get our population collectively and our politicians wanting to make it happen. And I think that's the trick.
Okay.
Do we know who that was, Nick? Do you think he has those words of wisdom? His name?
No, let's hear his name.
I'm Gerald Allison.
Thank you very much indeed. Mark, listen, you don't strike me as someone who's depressed and suicidal.
No, I'm not depressed and suicidal.
So how are you going to bring around a culture shift?
Actually, whilst we have this incredibly dysfunctional marketplace called the British housing economy, I'm growing a fast-moving SME into filling in the gaps and the nooks and the crannies. So I think there is opportunity out of chaos. And that's why I would encourage more SMEs to enter the market, because meanwhile, whilst the biggest don't make the progress that they should be making, the SMEs can actually do a heck of a lot of good work. But the biggest are not going to really sort the problems that we've got until we acknowledge that, what I said earlier, countries get the housing that they deserve culturally, and what we need is political reform. And the political reform that the country needs to deal with these incredibly integrated and frankly, complex issues that need more civil service power, that need the integration of lots of areas of expertise. I'm afraid it's proportional representation. You cannot do it within a first-past-the-post system in which the electoral system every 5 years changes its colour.
So PR will bring about a cultural shift in the housing sector as well.
I'm absolutely convinced that there is a very, very close correlation between first-past-the-post and NIMBYism.
Right. Andrew Telfer.
I think there are reasons for optimism. It's not all doom and gloom. I think with your 3 children, question mark, it sounded like they're looking to buy. Are they? Or are they looking to rent?
They're looking to raid his piggy bank, actually.
Because, I think, the one thing we have a great entrepreneurial spirit, I think, and there are some great brains focused on the market and how do we deliver homes despite all of the issues that we've heard here. And we've taken our business from a very, very small level through to 1,300 PRS homes under development and over 2,500 private sale, despite this market. So it is, and people tell me, it's not possible to do that in London. And yet we're doing it, and partly it's about being entrepreneurial, about how you combine on larger schemes as well, because I agree with some of the points that Robert made, that combining on larger schemes and delivering other assets that the public sector needs or the community needs. There are really special skill sets around that, and understanding what the stakeholders really need as part of that. And you can introduce different tenure mixes in that way to accelerate developments. And that acceleration, really, is one of our schemes. We're 2 years ahead of plan because we've brought the PRS element into it as well. And it's created that sense of place and with a park and all the rest of it.
I will stop there because we're heading towards our last 10 minutes or so, and we'd like to get questions. That's great. Gerald, behind you, young man, he's in a shirt. If you could get your name, that'd be great.
My name's Nick Taylor from Carter Jonas, and it's probably 2 points. One is very interested in something that Mark said about as a society and a country, you get the quality of housing you deserve. DCLG have published some research which shows that under the current government proposals, which are under review for PD rights offices to residential, the smallest housing unit they've seen built is 13.5 square metres, which is a disgrace. So I do think that we do need to have this wider, mature debate about the quality of housing, because those sorts of units are feeding the 140,000 figure that we've heard mentioned already. And I think linked to that, as part of that mature debate, I think the whole Greenbelt shrillness argument needs a little bit of mature lead from government to say, look, we're not changing Greenbelt policy, but what we are going to do, and I think London should lead that, and it should be a GLA-led initiative, is let's have a metropolitan London-wide review of, is all of the land that's in the Greenbelt serving the purpose that it was originally designated as? Some land will come out, and that will be part of the contribution to the debate about going up in certain locations. But at the moment, this little bite-sized, let's deal with it in this bit or that bit, isn't going to solve the housing crisis, not just in London, but not anywhere. So I personally think in London, I know there's a debate about do you change the area of the GLA's remit, but I think London's only going to solve its housing crisis if the GLA take a very strong lead across all of the boroughs to try and have a proper plan for delivery right across London. Because without that, we'll continue to go in dribs and drabs across London as a whole, in my view.
Let's say a quick one from you, Mark, and we'll bring Trudy in on this as well. Mark?
Well, we've got a mayoral election coming up. You make your choices, and if housing is indeed, I'm a bit with Robert on this, by the way. I mean, I keep hearing that housing is so incredibly important. The truth is that the millennials are too exhausted when they come home to paint the placards and build the barricades that they should be building to throw the rotten tomatoes at the politicians. So the very people that should be out there making a lot of noise about this are not doing it. But there is an election coming up. I don't think Sadiq Khan has got a housing strategy yet. If he has one, he's keeping it incredibly quiet. I don't think Zach Goldsmith has articulated a clear housing strategy, so we should all put pressure on them to do that, and we'll judge them accordingly.
Robert in a moment, Trudy next.
Well, I suppose in terms of causes for optimism, we do have the expertise in this country to do this. We know how to plan, we know how to build, we know how to create communities. We're exporting this skill all around the globe as we speak. So we've got the ability to do it, and we've got lots of examples of where we do. What we've got to engender, I think, is a bit more political will and leadership. I think it's very telling when you talk to any of the political parties at the moment, there are some subjects that are just out of bounds because they're too difficult a conversation to have. And Greenbelt's one of them. Well, actually, if your politicians aren't even prepared to have a conversation, I think it slightly explains, some of the disillusion in some quarters with the political establishment, because actually we do expect our politicians to do a bit of leading and to have uncomfortable conversations with us. I'm the mother or godmother or aunt to a lot of 20-year-olds, and actually it is the topic of conversation amongst them at the moment, and it's not just about whether they will ever.
And that's all around the country.
And that's all around the country, particularly in London and the southeast, but places like Oxford. And it's not just about whether they can buy. It's what percentage of their income they're having to spend on rent, and actually whether they've got any security. I mean, they have to move every 6 months because they can't get longer than a 6-month shorthold. So this is going to come up the political agenda.
You wanted to say something?
Well, yeah, this disillusionment, if you like, with our decision-making, our politicians, our sector. To answer Gerald's point, I blame the 60s, basically. I think we wrecked a lot of places, and people have looked back and thought planners are rubbish because they let all that crap happen. And I think we've never quite got back to that. But I think if we are going to do all
Did
this
you let
stuff...
that crap happen? Not you, but do you think
Well,
your officers let that
No,
crap
I
happen?
don't think that actually, if you look back, a lot
Some
of
of them
what...
are pretty ugly, aren't
yeah,
they?
and a lot of what people don't like was often done in the name of public
Anyway.
health, not planning. So.
All right.
Anyway, so I think we have this low point. I mean, there's a chap called David Halpin, I think he was Number 10's policy unit for a while. He wrote this book, and he said the UK is unique in having low public trust in the public sector and the private sector all at the same time.
Yeah.
And most countries have one or the other, but not both. So we are in, I suppose, a little bit of a perilous state. But I think part of the answer, we're just going to have to bribe people. I think we have to bribe people who are older to leave their 3 and 4 bedroom homes that they own outright. We now have more homes owned outright in this country than we do with a mortgage. So we have to bribe them to leave those homes and make another choice. We have to bribe people who live in places that are going to grow to accept new housing. And how do we do that? Well, actually through infrastructure. The experience of places where you live which have had growth is that the schools and the health and the transport lag. They come later. You get the growth first, you get the infrastructure later. The way to bribe people is to put those things in first so that you get the reward of extra health provision, the reward of better schools, and the reward of infrastructure ahead of the growth. If we actually figured out a way of bribing people in advance, people would want the growth. It's the same thing that we had with the Channel Tunnel. Do you remember when the Channel Tunnel was built? There were towns in Kent competing to be off the route, and there were towns in France competing to be on the route. Yes. And that basically sums up the difference.
All right, there's an email question which I think will probably be the last question. And again, panel, you're going to have about a minute and a bit to respond because we're coming towards the end and I'm sure there's some thirsty people out there. This is from Richard Aylwin. Community Secretary Greg Clark has given housing associations a week to consider a voluntary agreement on right to buy extension. Geeta Nanda, Chief Executive of Thames Valley Housing, is positive, says it gives them more flexibility to build social housing, whereas Tom Murtha, ex-Chief Executive of Midland Heart, says it was proposed with a gun to the sector's head. What does the panel think? Should housing associations, I'm coming to you, Andrew Jones, by the way, first. What does the panel think? Should housing associations be selling off their housing? What effect would it have on housing supply? Andrew.
No.
Thank you. That's what I like. That's definitely in under a minute. If you want to elaborate, you
so
can.
I can elaborate a bit further on that. So if we were replacing, if we were selling off housing from the housing associations and replacing on a one-for-one basis or a one point something basis, then great. But actually, I think that the history is telling us that I think it's one for every 9 homes that are sold off, that only 1 is replaced. So there's we haven't got the right solution yet, because what we've been talking about tonight is increasing the number of homes that are available. We haven't delved into affordability a great deal this evening, although access to the housing market has been a key issue. And if you're taking some of the social housing stock out, then you're making it even more difficult. So I don't think the solution is right at the moment.
All right. Mark Blissing.
Well, given that we all agree that there is a huge imbalance between a lack of supply and overwhelming demand, to get in the way of one of the most established and well-oiled channels to delivery, namely the housing association movement, and tell them that you've got to do 2 things to reduce their financial clout, both in terms of lowering their rents and the whole right to buy phenomenon, seems to me quite extraordinary. So I think the government hasn't judged that at all right, and I think they'll rue the day that they made that decision.
Come to you, Robert. Robert Evans.
Well, what we have now is a fudge. It's a fudge because it's a crap policy, and it was probably only put in there for the coalition that never happened, for the Lib Dems to knock out. And then, hey presto, we didn't have a coalition. The Tories won, which they were surprised at, and now it's a manifesto commitment they had to deliver on. So it sounds like a workable fudge has been arrived at, but the policy is mad. The idea that extending the right to buy at a time when we have the conditions that are being described in the way that was proposed was just ridiculous, and it shows that the preoccupation of this government in particular is not building more homes. Its preoccupation is with home ownership.
Yeah. Andrew Telfer.
Yeah, I mean, I don't agree that the housing association should be selling off. I think the other issue is around the local authority stock as well with right to buy, because you've got major estates that are becoming increasingly less viable in order to regenerate them and put the density in to get the much needed homes.
And lastly, Trudy.
Well, the evidence shows that it won't increase supply, which is what we're talking about here. And I think housing associations have assessed that the rent reduction directly translates into them building 25,000 less homes a year. And they're the experts on what it will mean for them.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end. Your appreciation, we've travelled everywhere from the Manchester Powerhouse to block rail lines in East Croydon. Your appreciation, please, for the panel. Thank you very much indeed. And just with a few brief closing words, appreciation also, please, for Rebecca Evans, who's President of IBP. Rebecca, come on up, please.
Good evening. I'm Rebecca Evans. I'm the editor of Construction News, and more significantly, in terms of this evening, I am the president of the IBP. On behalf of IBP, I'd like to thank Hogan Lovells for hosting this event this evening in this fantastic auditorium, so thank you very much. This is an annual event, and I think the quality of the debate and the calibre of the speakers this evening demonstrates perfectly the value of the IBP in bringing people together for this kind of quality networking and learning events like this one. So I'd like to thank you all for coming and invite you to join our panellists and myself upstairs for a drink and to carry on the debate. And before we do that, I'd just like to ask you once again to please thank our chair and our panellists this evening.